Good evening. My name is Professor Yolanda Moses, and I'm a Fulbright Distinguished Chair for Cultural Competence in the National Center for Cultural Competence. I'm a visiting professor from the University of California, Riverside, and I've been here since January, so I'm getting to know the campus. I'm so glad to see all of you here tonight because you're in for a special treat. But before beginning tonight's event, I want to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This land has always been a learning space for many Aboriginal nations. And the NCCC, the National Center for Cultural Competence, draws strength and guidance from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, one of the oldest knowledge systems in the world. For those of us who are not Aboriginal and who are visitors to this land, it is an honor to acknowledge and pay my respect to the elders that are here, and we do have some elders here, and to the others past, present, and future. We also acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty has never been ceded and continues to thrive in many different forms. So welcome. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, Dr. V.P. Franklin, and if he wants to, he'll tell you what VP stands for. But Dr. Franklin is a colleague of mine who finished his career at the University of California, Riverside as a professor emeritus. So that's how I got to know him in person, but I knew of his reputation for a good 20 or 25 years before. He is a distinguished emeritus professor of history and education from the University of California, Riverside, and since 2002, he has served as the editor of the Journal of African American History in the United States, formerly called, in the old days, the Journal of Negro History, and just completed its 101st volume. So it's the oldest African American journal in the United States. In 2004-5 year, Dr. Franklin held the Fulbright Commission's Uppsala Chair in American Studies at the Swedish Institute for North American Studies in Uppsala, at Uppsala University, Sweden. Between 2000 and 2002, he was the Rosa and Charles Kessler Professor of Arts and Humanities at Xavier Universities, and it's one of our oldest historically Black Catholic universities in the United States. And in 2005, he was appointed to the Rivius O. Ortiz Endowed Chair in Politics, Historical Inquiry, and Social Thought at Dillard University, also in New Orleans, and also historically Black college. I met VP after the Katrina hurricane because he was at Dillard University at that time. And after the waters of the hurricane receded, there were a lot of very important papers that many universities lost. And we were very lucky that when people found out that V.P. Franklin was looking for a place to stay until he could go back to New Orleans, he chose us. So I was very happy, very, very happy. His education is from Penn State, from Harvard, where he got his master's degree, and from the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD. He's taught at numerous colleges and universities around the United States over the years with distinguished appointments, including Yale, University of Illinois, University of Pennsylvania, Drexel University, Teachers College, Columbia University, and he was a senior lecturer in American history at the Universidad de Barcelona and Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona in Spain. He has produced over 70, besides editing the journal, over 70 scholarly journals, 5 books, co-edited 4 books, 2 of which I'm going to read you the titles because it'll give you his range. One of them is Sisters in the Struggle, African American Women in the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, and their connection to the Black Power movement. So that's a part of that connection that you'll hear about. And he's focused on women, which you don't always hear about in the Civil Rights Movement. And then the other one I like is Message in the Music, Hip Hop History, and Pedagogy. So he's with the times. He's been on the editorial boards of numerous journals and is currently completing a study of children and teenagers in the civil rights movement in the United States and eventually in other places, I imagine. So, Dr. V.P. Franklin, the podium is yours.
I'm really happy to be here this evening. This is my first time in Australia. This has been on my bucket list, for many years. There was a historical congress that met here in 2005, and I was supposed to come to meet here in Sydney, and I was supposed to come at that time, but I actually wrote a paper and submitted the paper, and they approved the paper, and so I was all ready to go. I'd already written the paper, but then I got the position at Dillard University in New Orleans, and this is in 2005, the summer of 2005. And so I got this chair. They had a new endowed chair at Dillard University, and so they asked me to come in 2005. And so I arrived I had to move from Columbia University. I was in New York City and had to move from New York City to New Orleans over the summer of 2005. And then so I arrived in New Orleans on about August 15th and shipped all my stuff down to New Orleans, and we already had a house in New Orleans from having been a visiting professor at Xavier. And so we got there on about August 15th, and and classes started on about August 20th, and then we had the first week of classes, and then on August 28th we had Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. And it was, as you know, a horrible event. It was a horrible event for me and my partner because everything that we had brought from New York City, from Columbia University, where I had been teaching, to moving to accept this endowed chair. Oh, I got this endowed chair, I'm moving everything. But we had a house, we put the stuff in storage, and it was in St. Bernard Parish, and St. Bernard Parish flooded completely. We lost everything. The one good thing was that our house was not flooded, so we had our house. And so we look on that situation as one where we know people who lost so much more than we did. And so, so we recovered. But the problem was that Dillard University had to downsize as a result, because many of the students who had been displaced didn't return. And so they had to downsize and change their courses, the courses of study and curricula. And so they told faculty that, you had to sort of look for another job somewhere else because we don't know whether or not we're going to keep you, because they didn't know how many students were going to return. And so, they kept me for a couple of years, but they eventually downsized the history department. And that's when I took the position at the University of California at Riverside and met the wonderful people there, Yolanda Moses among all the other people, and it was a really wonderful experience. And I stayed there for 8 years and just retired in 2015. But since 2001, 2002, I've been the editor of the Journal of African American History. And as Yolanda mentioned, it is the oldest, I think it's like the 3rd oldest historical publication in the United States. And I took it over in 2002 was the first publication. 2001 is when I took it over. And what was really good about that was that I was able to publish the latest research that was coming out on the Black Power movement and also on Malcolm X. Now, I wanted to say something about Malcolm X. I had already done research on Malcolm X and published a book on African American intellectual history where I had discussed Malcolm X's contribution to African American intellectual thought in the 20th century. So I was familiar, had done research on Malcolm X, and research was coming out on the Black Power movement. It was beginning. So we're in 2002, 2003, and because the research on the Black Power movement, not just in the United States, but around the world, was just beginning. Researchers were just beginning to do research on the Black Power movement. I was able to use the journal to document the movement as this new research came out over the last 10, 15 years. And so the handout that you have are all of the books that were reviewed on Black Power and the articles that I'm going to discuss some of them today, including an article, a very, very good and I think an important article on Malcolm X and the Black Power movement in Australia. And so so we can follow along. You'll be able to follow along with me. You'll see how this research, this scholarship developed over this last 15, 16 years. And I just happen to be the editor of the journal, and so I got to publish all of these things. So that was positive for me. Okay, I'm gonna start out by pointing out that Black Power as a term, had been around, and you had in 1954 the publication of Richard Wright, the novelist Richard Wright's Black Power. He published a book. The title of the book was Black Power, an American Negro views the African Gold Coast, and was on his trips and travels in Africa in 1950. So the term, so we have the term Black Power, which preceded the slogan Black Power. And so that what happens is that the slogan Black Power then travels throughout the United States and then travels throughout the world. And Black Power came to mean something very specific in the United States as a slogan, but it also came to mean something very specific as a slogan in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Australia, and in Canada, and various other parts of the world, and so that you have to think of this as transnational movement. That the concept and slogan of Black Power was adopted and then adapted to the particular circumstances in those different countries. And what was really nice is that through the journal, I was able to document how Black Power played out, how it developed in these various countries, in the United States, mostly in the United States since this is what the journal covers, but also in these various other countries. In terms of Malcolm X and Black Power, that most scholars believe that Malcolm X was the progenitor of Black Power. When they interviewed individuals who adopted the slogan Black Power, and those who were familiar with the works, the writings of Malcolm X, they looked on Malcolm X as the progenitor. After his assassination, for example, before I started publishing articles on Black Power in about 2003, 2004. There was really only one book on Black Power in the United States, and that was William Vandenberg's A New Day in Babylon, Black Power in the United States. And after Malcolm X's assassination, Vandenberg, this is from his book, the only book, this is one book on Black Power, Vandenberg's published New Day in Babylon. William Vandenberg said, quote, "Malcolm came to be far more than a martyr for the militant separatist faith, the Nation of Islam. He became a Black Power paradigm, the archetype, the reference point, the spiritual advisor in absentia for a generation of African American activists," unquote. But we know it wasn't just African American activists, it's for activists in various other parts of the world as well. Now, Black Power as a slogan we associate with Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael and the Meredith March Against Fear took place in 1966, and it was at that time that Stokely Carmichael announced what do we want? Black Power, when do we want it now? What do we want? Black Power, when do we want it now? And it spread like wildfire throughout the country, and people developed either support, they either accepted the idea of Black Power, oh yeah, well, blacks want to, want self-determination. They want to be able to develop their own communities, et cetera. They want to have their own businesses and institutions, and they want power. They want electoral power as well. And so that within the civil rights movement that was going on at the time, there was a split. There was a split between those who supported the slogan. Now, we're dealing with the slogan Black Power. And so in the case of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, they adopted Black Power as a slogan and pursued it in various parts of the South, particularly involving themselves in electoral politics, okay, like the Black Panther Party, in Mississippi, for example. The other group that supported Black Power was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. They said, yes, that's the new objective. It's not just to be integrated into American society, it is also to develop institutions controlled, economic institutions, political institutions, cultural institutions controlled by people of African descent. So the Congress of Racial Equality adopted the Black Power slogan and the Black Power concept. The NAACP, however, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the group that was associated with Martin Luther King, which Martin Luther King founded, they opposed it. They denounced it. They said, no, Black Power is going to, calling for Black Power will drive away white allies of the civil rights movement. And so they said, we don't believe in it, we don't support it. And so there was a division. There was a division between those who supported the concept of Black Power, the slogan of Black Power, and those who opposed it. Then you had certain groups emerge in the late 1960s in the United States that supported the concept of Black Power. That is, those were the four civil rights. Remember, there are four civil rights groups. Two supported it, two did not. But then you had new Black Power groups emerge, such as the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, the Black Panther Party in 1966, the US organization founded by Ron Karenga in Los Angeles, and they were a black nationalist group. You had the National Black Economic Development Conference, and that was the group that pushed for reparations and issued the Black Manifesto in 1969, and then pushed for reparations for African Americans, the National Black Economic Development Conference. The Black Panther Party was formed in August 1966 after Carmichael declared the need to pursue Black Power. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale had studied the speeches and writings of Malcolm X as members of the Afro-American Association and the Seoul Students Advisory Council at Merritt College in Oakland, California. And they also worked with the members of RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement. They both were profoundly affected by Malcolm's assassination, and so they created the Black Panther Party to promote armed self-defense against police violence and police brutality. When historians began to document the civil rights movement, they tended to view Black power as having killed the movement. The coming of Black power killed the civil rights movement. So it was negative. It was viewed as negative. Sometimes they said, "Oh, Black power, that's the evil twin of the civil rights movement." So this was the interpretation, so that a lot of historians were reluctant to study it, to look at it, because they said this was a negative movement. It was, and so we need to document the civil rights movement, which was positive and brought about all these changes. We don't want to touch the Black power movement because that's negative. And so for years and years, for decades, you had all of this research carried out on the civil rights movement, but almost no research on Black power. Okay, on what happened as a result of Black power. So that was the difference. The first group of scholars who involved themselves in documenting Black power tended to be the political scientists. And the reason why was because Black power, the phrase Black power, was used by elected people seeking political office. And they wanted to mobilize the Black community to vote for them. And so they used we want Black power in order to mobilize the Black voters. And so the earliest studies of any kind of Black power were usually carried out by politicians, because it looked at those Blacks that were elected to political office using the idea of achieving Black electoral power. So those were the earliest groups. And then, and that takes us up to like 2000. You don't have any research being carried out. It takes us to 2000. What we discovered was that many of the the politicians who used the Black Power slogan to gain political office had previously been civil rights activists. They were civil rights activists, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson. I mean, if you look at the black mayors who were elected, most of them had previously been involved in the civil rights movement. And so the first approach to the scholarship was to make the connection between civil rights to Black power, because you had the same people. Some of them were the same people. That is, these individuals who had been involved in the civil rights movement moved into electoral politics. And so the emphasis in the earliest research was on the continuities between civil rights and Black power. And that was the basis of the research and the book and the conference and stuff that I did with my colleague Betty Collier Thomas. Came out, this is in 2001, Sisters in the Struggle, African American Women in the Civil Rights - Black Power Movement. Okay, all right, so continuity. And so we were looking and so we said some of these women who were involved in Black power had been in the civil rights campaign. And so so we emphasized these continuities in our book on African American women in the civil rights - Black power movement, and emphasize these continuities. And so this came out in 2001, okay? And I became editor of the journal in 2002. I mean, the first issue that I edited came out in 2002. So these Black power groups were I was beginning to, let's see, people were beginning to examine the impact of Black power in other places. And so they would submit their articles to the journal, and I would eventually publish them. So that, in other words, when I took over the journal, it was individuals were not just speaking in terms of the continuities between civil rights and Black power in the United States. They were looking at it in other countries. The first, of course, were in Canada, and then in the Caribbean, in terms of how the Black power slogan was utilized to mobilize people to bring about some kind of political change, some kind of economic change, some kind of social change. And so, as these books then began to appear and articles began to appear, and I began to publish them. So you have in your sheet, you'll notice the article by Peniel Joseph, the first article you see there from 2003, Dashikis and Democracy, Black Studies, Student Activism, and Black Power Movement. That was now keep in mind, the one thing that researchers could definitely point to as a direct result of the Black Power movement was the creation of Black Studies programs in universities throughout the United States. And so there was no doubt that Black Studies programs were not so much associated with civil rights, they were really associated with Black power. And so Peniel Joseph's article dealt with the formation of these Black Studies programs so this was an article, okay, in 2003. And of course the material that was in that article then became part of his book, which came out in 2006. His book was Waiting to the Midnight Hour, History of Black Power Movement. Okay, so I just want to see how this is happening. That is, first the articles are published in the journal, and then eventually book-length studies on these topics that appear. So that's, I'm pretty proud of that. That's really nice, because I can say, okay, look at all these articles that were published in the journal, and these are the books that eventually were published, so that there's no doubt that what I was engaged in was creating new knowledge, almost a new subfield in African American history. You had the articles published in the journal, and then expanded into these book-length studies, beginning with that first one by Peniel Joseph. The next book, remember the only one book came out, it was The New Day in Babylon by Vanderburg, but the next book to come out on Black Power, you have it on your list there, Black Power, Radical Politics, and African American Identity, which came out in 2004. It's interesting. There's a chapter, chapter 5 in the Agbar book, is titled Black Power and the Decline of the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, all right, so this is so it's still that idea that Black power killed off the Civil Rights Movement, and that's in this early book on Black Power. That was the title of the chapter. But one thing that was distinctive about Agbar's book on Black Power was that he dealt with the Black Studies programs and and Black power groups that emerged. But he also, and what was really interesting about him is he dealt with Puerto Rican power. That is, the Puerto Rican groups that developed women's power. That was followed Black power, the women's liberation movement that came about, gay liberation movement. And so he connected Black power to these other liberation, these other movements among minority groups in the United States. So that was an important advancement that came with his book in 2004. That's 2004. In that he pointed out how Black power led to women's power, to Chicano power, to red power among the Native Americans, etc. So that was an important advancement. Now, The next important article that I wanted you to point out is the article, and you can sort of look at this. Look, if you see it on the sheet, it's called "The Long Movement as Vampire, Temporal and Spatial Fallacies in Recent Black Freedom Studies" by Sundiata Chajua and Clarence Lang. Okay, that came out in 2007. Okay, now, all right, before I just have a question. Vampires. Okay. What is it that makes a vampire distinctive? What is it that the vampire has, qualities, etc., the vampire has that makes it distinctive? Anybody? What is it? Okay, all right, that's the answer I wanted. Sucks on your blood. But there are other animals that suck on blood. It's not just vampires. The distinctive characteristic that they were zeroing in on was that it didn't die. They don't die. Okay, they live forever. Vampires live forever. That was the characteristic that they were zeroing in on, because that article, they were challenging the concept that had come to fore in a couple of years earlier, the idea of the long civil rights movement. And you had, a historian published papers and argued that, well, the civil rights movement, really continued on, began really in the 1930s, and and that it had all, and then it continues, and then in the 50s and the 60s, and then it sort of morphed into Black Power, so that it's really, all of this is part of this long civil rights movement. And so that argument was being made, and a lot of scholars were, the long civil rights movement, your Black Power is really part of the long civil rights movement. Okay, it's not a distinct movement, it's part of the long civil rights movement. So Chajua and Lang challenged that idea. And they say, okay, the long civil rights movement is like a vampire. It don't die. It just began. It was, when Africans got off the ship. It continues on. And so they were challenging this idea of the long civil rights movement, and that Black Power was really part of this long. It wasn't a distinct movement. It was just part of this long civil rights movement. Well, it was an important article published in the journal and won the major prize as the best article published on American history in the United States in 2007. So by the Organization of American Historians, it won this major prize and stuff, because it was a major challenge to this idea of this long civil rights movement, and that Black Power is just part of this long civil rights movement. And then we went on to have the special issue in 2007, and I have it here, the special issue, New Black Power Studies, National, International, and Transnational Perspectives. This is fall 2007. And you have all of these different articles included on Black Power in there. You had, but the influence of Malcolm X is what pulls all of them together. All of these different aspects of the SNCC, leaders traveling to Africa, meeting up with Malcolm X while they were in Africa, and then becoming supporters of Malcolm's approach to Black Power. Then you had the article on I have an article in there. As you'll see my article in there on Jackanapes, Reflections on the Legacy of the Black Panther Party for the Hip Hop Generation. And that was, and that's a whole specific kind of thing that I pulled out of the Black Panther Party that you can ask me about when we have the question and answer because it's kind of complicated. And, you say, who are the jackanapes? Who are the jackanapes? Well, they were all over the Black Panther Party. and there was a debate about what brought about the demise of the Black Panther Party in the 1970s. And in this article, I suggest the jackanapes contributed to it. Okay? All right, but we get to that's kind of complicated, and I'll venture forth. But what is really important is the article by David Austin, which All Roads Lead to Montreal: Black Power, the Caribbean, and the Black Radical Tradition in Canada. Okay? All right, so this is 2007, and this is bringing in Black Power movements and activities in Montreal. You had the Caribbean Committee Conference formed in Montreal in 1965, and then you had them having a major conference in 1967, and Stokely Carmichael and James Foreman. James Foreman had been the head of SNCC at one time, and they came and spoke. But David Austin argues in there that you had Afro-Canadians involved in social justice campaigns from the 1950s and 1960s, and then they adopted the Black Power concept and the Black Power slogan, and then proceeded to make demands on Canadian society for change and equal rights and equal treatment and the end of discrimination against people of African descent in Canada. Although you had individuals who had led the Black Power movement in the United States going to Canada and participating in Black Power conferences in Canada, in Montreal, the movement itself was generated locally, that is, you had Black mobilizations in Canada, various parts of Canada before then, and they adopted the Black Power slogan, and then they continued. And then there was also some violence, et cetera, associated with it. At Sir George Williams University, there was a takeover of a building, and the police came and tear gassed the students who were in the building, et cetera. And so all I'm saying is that Black Power traveled to Canada, but the people who adopted the Black Power slogan utilized it for their own specific objectives, and that becomes the case in Australia as well. They develop it for their own purposes. The Canadian Conference Committee that held that conference that Stokely Carmichael attended, and that's him at that conference in Canada on the cover of the book. They established the National Black Coalition of Canada in 1968, and then you had the Congress of Black Writers in October 1968, and all of these became Black Power groups in Canada that sought improvements in the conditions for people of African descent in Canada. The pattern in the Caribbean was similar. That is because Stokely Carmichael was originally from Trinidad, and so he went there and he was banned when they tried to get into Trinidad in the late 1960s. The government banned him because Black Power would have to take on a different meaning in a Black-controlled country. Okay, so these Caribbean countries were independent at this time, and so Black Power had to adapt. The concept had to be adapted to a situation where the entire population is Black. And so, what does Black Power mean there? Well, it means in Trinidad, for example, it meant a movement for a redistribution of the wealth. Okay, and so it travels. But in the case of Canada, particularly, less so in the Caribbean, it was Malcolm X. The writings, the speeches, the autobiography of Malcolm X that inspired these activists, these particularly young people, to move in, to mobilize, to move, to try to bring about social change in those societies. And so, and in the case of the Caribbean, Malcolm X was less the progenitor of the movement there. In other words, they accepted the slogan. There were some who were familiar with Malcolm X and Malcolm X writing and speeches, et cetera, and they evoked Malcolm X and when they spoke about Black Power, but it was the local concerns, the local resistance, the local political activism that gave meaning to the slogan Black Power in those places. Canada, for example, the influence of Malcolm X is specific, is there. The Congress of Black Writers, one of the works that they were studying, pushing, was the autobiography of Malcolm X. This is what they were reading, and they were advocating that people read, et cetera. And the speeches and of Malcolm and other writings. The other books came out and articles came out. For example, if you look at the article by Abby Abugo-Algiri, her article, Prisoner of Love, Affiliation, Sexuality, and the Black Panther Party. That is, I think that's 2010. Prisoner of Love, Affiliation, Sexuality, and the Black Panther Party. Again, this was an article where she looked at the impact of Jean Genet's support for the Black Panther Party. The novelist Jean Genet, came to the United States, traveled around the United States, worked with the Black Panther Party, and helped raise money for the Black Panther Party in the early 1970s. And of course, and then turns into her book, which is also on there, which is the title of her book. Let's see. So I'm trying to make a connection between the articles published in the journal and the books. Where is her book? 2011, Spectacular Blackness. Okay, all right, now this is another article that eventually that starts out in the journal and then becomes a book, a larger study, Spectacular Blackness, the Cultural Politics of the Black Power Movement and the Search for a Black Aesthetic. And keep in mind, the Black Arts Movement was really, really very, very important. And she looks at the evolution of the Black Arts Movement. And you say, well, okay, well, how can you characterize the Black Arts Movement? Because the Black Arts Movement was associated with Black Power. Okay, so artists that were trying to pursue Black Power through their art. And so the way that I usually explain it to students, I say, okay, before the Black Arts Movement, you had Black artists writing about Black people for a white audience, okay? So you just think of Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Gwendolyn Brooks, James Baldwin. Black artists writing about Black people, but for a white audience. The difference with the Black Arts Movement was that it was Black artists writing about Black people for a Black audience. And that was the shift in consciousness that occurred among the artists in the late 1960s. I have other books listed here that were reviewed. Now keep in mind all of these, the references that I gave you, the journal is online. You can go online and look up and get these reviews, because the books that are listed in here are reviewed in the journal. Okay, so you can go online and look at this, such as Bad Bitches and Sassy Supermamas, Black Power and action films, etc. That was the so-called blaxploitation films, etc. And so you can look at the review of that. All right, the direct influence of Malcolm X on the movement in the United States is in the article, as you see if you look at summer 2011, number 3, people all over the world are supporting you. Malcolm X, ideological formation and black student activism, 1960 to 1972. Okay, and so this was an article where the author traced the student, when Malcolm X came to a campus and spoke to students, and they then traced what the students did following Malcolm X's, time spent on the campus. And also, the author looked at how the students that became activists then characterized their experience of reading Malcolm, of hearing Malcolm's speeches, etc. So that connection is direct in terms of the students, and it's documented there in that article. People all over the world are supporting you, as you see. An article that came out in 2011, and if you turn the page, you'll see the book, the book that comes out afterwards in 2013 by Ibram Rogers, The Black Campus Movement, Black Students and the Racial Reconstitution of Higher Education, 1965 to 1972. Okay, so I'm making that connection so that the article these start out as articles in the journal, and then they go on to be expanded into books. All right, the next is another one. Here's I don't know. You can look at this. There's a book the book that's that came out in 2000. I guess it's 2011. The book came out. Or 2009, the book came out, Harlem versus Columbia University, Black Student Power in the Late 1960s by Stephen Bradley. You'll see back in 2003, Stephen Bradley wrote an article on Columbia University students, etc. So that there's a connection between the article and the books that come out. All right, now, we want to get to the winter spring 2012, 1-2. We are demanding $500 million for reparations, the Black Manifesto, mainline religious denominations, and Black economic development. Okay? That is part of the reparations issue, special issue of the journal. And so you must keep in mind that the demand for reparations was originally part of Black power demands in 1969, okay, and then it proceeded to be implemented. It was the National Black Economic Development Conference did confront Black churches and denominations in the United States and demanded that they support Black economic development projects in the United States and pay in the form of reparation. The churches benefited from slavery and Jim Crow, and so therefore the churches they're demanding that the churches pay reparations to support Black economic development in the 1960s. And so, and then the reparations movement continued. You have other reparations groups in the 1970s and 1980s, but as you know, there's this resurgence of reparations demands and reparations movements in the Caribbean, beginning in the Caribbean with CARICOM and also coming in the United States. The 2013, you see in 2013, you have number 4, the essay, When the Revolution Comes, New Perspectives on Black Student Activism and Black Studies. And then in 2015, you have Malcolm X and the Aboriginal Black Power Movement in Australia, the article by Elisa Trometter. Does anybody here know Elisa? Does everybody know Elisa? She's from here, and I think she got her degree here at University of Sydney. But this article traces the conditions for Indigenous people, for the Aboriginal people in Australia, their development of various kinds of resistance movements from the 1930s and 1940s up through the 1960s, and then documents the movement in the late 1960s that for Black Power, that and many of the participants in Black Power movements in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney were interviewed by Trometter, and she has all of these wonderful quotes in which these individuals who were active in the Black Power movement in those cities, for example, you had the Black Panther Party. I think there were 5 chapters of the Black Panther Party in Australia. And when these individuals were interviewed, each of them said that they were greatly influenced by Malcolm X, that the writings of Malcolm X came to them through the African American soldiers who came during their off time, during their free time, came to Australia, came to Sydney, came to Brisbane, brought books on the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, brought all those materials with them, shared them with the Aboriginal students in Brisbane, particularly because they formed the first Black Panther Party there, and then other places in other cities, and said that the influence of Malcolm X was direct. But again, if in Trometter, in her article, she says specifically that the Black Power movement in Australia, in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney, it was a local movement. It was based on the conditions, the circumstances of the Aboriginal population in Australia, but it was influenced by, and may even been inspired by, the Black Power movement in the United States, but it was adapted to conditions here in Australia. And so, and that article is available online to you as well. I'm going to end because I think my time is up, but I want to have some questions. But I do want to point out another article. Well, 2 articles. One article is the one, Nothing is to be Feared, Norman C. Francis, Civil Rights Activist in the Black Catholic Movement. Again, Black Catholic movement in the United States came out of the Black Power movement and those who were active in the Black Catholic movement. And you have Black Catholic institutes, programs, et cetera, that were formed in the United States, particularly in New Orleans. You have a Black Catholic Institute and Black Studies programs at Catholic universities. These come out of the Black Power movement, so that's Black Catholics, and were greatly influenced by Malcolm X. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then we can have a little time for questions because it's kind of late and been running out, is you see the last article there, Malcolm X, The Prison Years, The Relentless Pursuit of Formal Education. I had the page proofs for that article in my bag. I'm still working on that. This work brings forth new information on Malcolm X prison years. This is how scholarship changed, how original knowledge develops as a result of the availability of new archival materials from the 3 prisons where Malcolm X was incarcerated. These materials are now available. We now know that, for those of you who have read the autobiography of Malcolm X, you know there's a chapter titled Satan. Okay, and he was a Satan, you know. But what these files reveal, and what is being revealed in this article, is that Malcolm X had been interested in gaining access to formal education, to courses in Greek and Latin and German and advance the literature from when he entered prison. That the idea that he was converted and became literary as a result, for example, of the debates that he was involved in, and the influence of Bimby, the orator who he says in the autobiography greatly influenced him. But what these letters reveal, what these new materials reveal, is that he was pursuing higher education, advanced courses before he met Bimby. And so this is really new information, and I have that material, and we'll be publishing that in the next issue of the journal. Okay, thank you very much. I'll take questions now. Have time for a few questions?
Yes.
How would you say Black Power movement was influenced by Marcus Garvey?
Marcus Garvey had always been associated with Black Power. It's sort of like the idea of a long Black Power movement, okay? And so that you have certain scholars who have sort of taken this sort of long Black Power movement approach, and they trace it to Garvey movement and the National Negro in the 1920s, the National Negro Congress in the 1930s, the let's see, what's in the 50s? The boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. In other words, they see those as examples of Black Power. And Marcus Garvey was important for the Black Power movement, and he was rediscovered and became really important through the Black Studies programs. And so once he was brought back, he was brought back into the consciousness of researchers and scholars and historians, then some people argue that you had a long Black Power movement, and it really began with Garvey. I don't necessarily accept that, like it's sort of like something coming and something actually there. And so when you deal with social movements, you deal with the objectives, the strategies, the leaders, the organizations, the successes, the failures of the movement. And when you interpret the Black Power movement in that way, the objectives, the strategies, the leaders, the organizations, the successes and the failures, you say, oh yeah, that was Black Power movement. Wasn't anything like the Civil Rights Movement, because its objectives were different, its strategies were different, its successes were different, etc. And so that's why we can say that there is and this is why people challenge that long Civil Rights Movement argument, because they can say that no, Black Power was different from the Civil Rights Movement. If you look at it as a social movement, you'll see its objectives were different, its leaders were different, its organizations were different, etc. So it is a separate movement, and so you can't lump the Black Power movement into an idea of a long Civil Rights Movement. So Garvey is a part of it, but if you look on Black Power as a social movement, it begins in the mid-60s and goes through like the end of the 1970s, and that was a precursor. Garvey movement laid the groundwork, et cetera, for the Black Power movement. Any other questions? Yes.
Right. Thank you very much for that talk. I guess my question is, I've grown up sort of seeing images of, in the 1970s and people like my aunties and uncles and fathers, being out and mobilising and being activists on the streets. And you talked about this having a deep history in Australia, since the early 20th century. But really it's kind of fallen away. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of parallels in America. I guess you have the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter and those kind of things. But I guess my observations is that we don't really have that mobilisations in the streets, that kind of activism that we had, the activism that we had in the 1970s and 60s. I guess, is there any kind of parallels or similarities? I guess from that, is it not?
We have been having a lot of people in the streets lately, and there have been mobilizations and activism in the United States over the last few years. Much of it associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when you had those instances, and of course, just like the riots in the 1960s that began in 1964 and went through 1968, and when they studied them, they found out that the reason for the riots were police brutality. And then, of course, this year we're commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Los Angeles riot. And that was another riot. And what was the cause of that riot? Police brutality. And now you have the Ferguson incident and the various other examples of police brutality and killing individuals, and the Black Lives Movement emerging from that. And so you have that so you have had a lot of protests and mobilizing that's taking place in the United States. It may have been drowned out now that we have the new president in terms of these huge marches and protests that are taking place to protest the election and activities of the new president. But the protests against against police brutality and police violence and murders in the United States are ongoing, and they are taking place now. And as one of the newer goals associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, their first objective is to get rid of police violence, to end police violence, and their second objective is reparations. And so you do have this mobilization. It's just that you have this broader mobilization. So it just has not been worked out between what is going to be the relationship between these previous, remember that these Black Lives Matter huge marches and protests that were taking place in the United States, what is going to be their relationship with these huge marches that are taking place against the new administration in the United States? But there is activism taking place. I've been to about five major protests and marches since January. One last question.
I'm interested in how media really plays a role in voicing, different people's concerns. And I know in Australia, where Aboriginal people are always determined as the other, and we're always doing bad things. And I'm wondering, do you have any sort of sanctions or legislation in America that puts an end to that negative kind of imposition on communities and sort of tells the fake news, I suppose, than the real news?
It's the mainstream sort of publications and journals that tend to want to uphold the status quo, okay, and they want to play down dissent and protests and those kinds of things. And in that kind of environment, what you have found is that you have alternative media being created. So you look at the Black Panther Party newspaper. The Black Panther Party newspaper is so important and stuff. And if you look into and in parallel, you have the Black Lives Matter and the various hashtags associated with it. In other words, it's the mainline media is trying to play down protests and these kinds of things, and that means that alternative media, alternative journalism, alternative outlets have to be created by these protest organizations to get their messages out. And so, and that is a pattern, you know, in terms of, oh, look, you know, it's sort of like the numbers and marches and protests, you know, the mainstream media. Oh, I remember one time, and I'm going to end with this. Excuse me. I was doing some research in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire in the early 1980s. And there was, and I was reading these American newspapers in Abidjan. And I remember that there was a mobilization to try to get Martin Luther King's birthday a holiday. We're talking about the early 1980s. They're trying to get Martin Luther King's birthday a holiday, which is now an official holiday in the United States. This is the early 1980s, and I'm at Abidjan. And I'm reading the reports in the papers in Abidjan on the mobilization. They were planning to have a march on Washington. So I picked up all of these papers in Abidjan, and they said, yes, 20,000 people marched on Washington to try to get Martin Luther King's birthday a holiday. Now, Stevie Wonder was leading that movement, as you recall. Happy birthday, that was his song for Martin Luther King. And in each of these papers, it said that 20,000 people had marched on Washington. I said, that's got to be wrong. If somebody said that Stevie Wonder was going to have a concert on any corner, then he would have more than 20,000 people show up if it was just the day before when they announced it. And so that's what I'm talking about, that you get that distortions, you know, in the mainstream media, and that's disseminated outside the United States, and incorrectly, and so there's a need for the alternative media to present that side of the story. Okay? All right, thank you.